everyone. Welcome and happy Tuesday. All right, if you're trying to figure out how to create the perfect webinar, well, you've joined the perfect webinar. We've got some great advice for you today. First of all, a shout out to our sponsor, GoToWebinar, for today's session on how marketers can make serious money, move the sales needle, and entertain audiences. I'm Stephanie Stahl, General Manager for the Content Marketing Institute, and I'll be your moderator. That's my Twitter handle there, @EditorStahl, if you'd like to connect that way. Before our guest speaker begins, let's review a few items to help you make the most of the next hour. First of all, bring on the questions. Please, at any point during the presentation, you can type a question into the Q&A box and hit send. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event, so no need to do anything on your end. If you have any technical issues, please alert us in the Q&A box, and we'll get someone to help you right away. And if you want a copy of the slide deck that you see today, you can download it in the handouts area. And an archive of this event will be sent in 24 hours or so please feel free to share it with your colleagues if you'd like. And finally, join the conversation at #CMWorld. Just a little bit of information about CMI if you don't know us already. We focus on helping companies create their own media channels to attract and retain customers through compelling storytelling. And we educate through our blog, our live events, our print magazine, which is called Chief Content Officer, and our consulting business. And speaking of events, Content Marketing World is coming up in early September in Cleveland, Ohio. We'd love to see you there. Check out our website for more on the agenda and the really great speakers we've got lined up for you. If you've been to Content Marketing World before, you know we also have some fun things planned, so we hope to see you there. If you're interested in online learning, you can sign up for alerts for our summer enrollment of CMI University. It's a great way to roll up your sleeves and learn at your own pace and, in your own time. All right, our guest speaker today is Mike Agron. He's the CEO and executive webinar producer for WebAttract, which he co-founded in 2008. They've delivered over 500 B2B demand generation webinars. He's also an award-winning author, producer, and frequent guest speaker on webinar demand generation best practices for such organizations as the American Marketing Association and our very own Content Marketing Institute. Last fall, he and his team were hired by GoToWebinar to train their global customer success agents with many of the tips he's going to share with you today. So, Mike, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and everybody. Welcome to the webinar, and thank you, GoToWebinar, for sponsoring this. The perfect webinar: how marketeers can make serious money, move the sales needle, and entertain audiences. It's a big topic, and we're going to cover a lot of that here. And the real thing to remember is that today webinars are a top content marketing tactic, and they have been for a long time. And of course, anybody can do a mediocre webinar, but how you can do one to accomplish these goals is the focus of what I'm going to be talking about today. And if you've attended any of the webinars we've done in the past, I always like to open with this slide because it really describes why I love webinars. Not only are they theatrical, they're like a radio show but with pictures, but they're really a great time to tell a story with real demonstrable business outcomes. But they're also a two-way conversation. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you, as the webinar producer, presenter, you provide expert knowledge. That's what you give. But if you do that, what you get is a lot of valuable life cycle intelligence and leads. And so I always like to say, let's give and then we get, rather than trying to get and we'll give you something. Towards the end, I have a couple of things I can share with you on how to help you get more and better outcomes. But for now, let's just get into what we're going to be talking about today. The tough part about putting this together is that we have a finite amount of time. And what I want to focus on is to give you some creative ideas so you can better attract, engage, and convert your audiences to really help them become interested and educated enough in what you have to help them out. And to do that, I'm going to give you some examples of key life cycle metrics to qualify webinar success. And in some of the case studies, you'll see examples. Then we're going to have some fun. I'm going to go through the top 10 blunders that should be avoided at all costs before, during, and after your webinar. And then we'll close by giving you some resources on how you can get started today. We've got some fantastic resources, because the real goal, and what I want you to walk away with, whether you're brand new to webinars or you're a veteran, is to look at some best practices. So how you can help move your prospects from just researching to ready to buy now. And I mentioned some complimentary resources. In the handout section, we have some resources for you. The Ultimate Planning Checklist for Successful Webinars is about 8 pages, and that's a complement to our book, Webinar Ready, our ebook that was actually commissioned by GoToWebinar. And it's really our playbook. It's a step-by-step guide to hosting successful webinars. It's free, and I'll tell you how to get it. Many things I'm going to be covering are in the checklist. So if it's not here, take a look at the checklist, and I promise you, using this checklist will help you increase your webinar success rate by an inordinate amount. But first, I want to get a little information about who's in the audience. So I'm going to launch a poll, and if you would be kind enough to weigh in, which of these scenarios best describe how you use webinars at your company? Is it mostly sales and product demos? Are you using them for demand generation webinars to acquire new sales leads? Are you doing it to gain market insights? Or are you just investigating using webinars, or you don't use webinars? And as you can see, most of you are using webinars for demand gen and new sales lead, which is great, which is what today is about. Some of you are using mostly for sales and product demos to gain market insights. You're 22%, or about a quarter, are investigating webinars, and 11% don't. So there's a third of you that aren't using webinars. Hopefully, we will do a good enough job to convince you why you should use webinars.
Are you surprised by any of that, Mike? Does that surprise you at all?
No. In fact, it's encouraging, because the fact that we have a lot of folks on here that are already using demand gen webinars, or using webinars for demand gen, is great. But I like these other use cases. And as I said, for the third that are investigating using webinars or don't do webinars, I want to hopefully give everybody some insights and some confidence to use it. I think one of the biggest challenges, if you're not using webinars or using them, is having the ability to adopt the use of webinars within your organization. As I said, it's a great content marketing staple. But in order to do that, in addition to adopting, you have to have successful outcomes. So the company will allow you to continue to be the webinar champion and retain using people. How about you, Stephanie? Any surprises for you?
No, not necessarily. In fact, I'm kind of happy to see that there is a nice number of people who are investigating it. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, they'll feel much more comfortable taking the lead.
You got it. So let's continue. So the first thing is to set the stage, and you probably heard in my introduction, I talk about webinars. We look at webinars as being very theatrical. So we use a lot of theatrical metaphors. And in setting the stage, the most important thing that we've learned is that if you're a webinar producer, your job is really an ongoing balancing act. You have to balance constantly between the business drivers. In other words, what is the value proposition of the webinar? Who's your target audience? What pain point, or how are you going to show them to get better outcomes? How do you define success? It goes on and on. Those business drivers are absolutely essential. But there's also a lot of scheduling and logistics and human nature, human factors, understanding your audience, understanding your speakers, engaging with them, and of course the technology. From GoToWebinar as a webinar hosting platform, or if you're integrating it with marketing automation, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. And a lot of these are covered both in the book and they're covered in the handout. But typically, since most of you are doing demand gen webinars, there's really 3 things that we look for in a B2B webinar. Are we trying to raise awareness of our brand? Are we trying to promote our thought leadership or drive sales, or a combination of all 3? But those are the typical demand gen objectives that we typically focus on to make sure that we are able to deliver to our audience something of value. And if you look at that, there's a lot of different ways to measure success of webinars. And in fact, for those of you that aren't, or that are investigating webinars and aren't using it, it goes beyond just net new closed deals. Of course, if we can close business, that's terrific. But not everybody's ready to buy now. And being able to convert a prospect into a customer is something that we've seen time and time again. It's also an opportunity to enable upsell and cross-sell to your existing base. Great way to increase your sales pipeline, and it lets you punch up above your weight and put you on the map as a viable player. And I'm going to show you some examples. Plus, you can reach new markets and geographies. And one thing I'd like you to do when I get into case studies, kind of take a mental picture of this slide here, because I'm going to come back to it and show you how we're able to touch on those. The life cycle of demand generation webinars is really three parts: attracting an audience that will get value, having them attend and keeping them engaged so they get value, and then being able to use metrics and analytics to identify who is sales ready, who needs more nurturing, who's not a fit, and being able to use these to better understand how you can engage post-webinar with your attendees. I think the most important thing, especially today, everybody is so busy. And where it says, is your topic or webinar really in the eyes of the attendee seen as a must-have or a nice-to-have? And if it's a must-have, it's going to show, as the gentleman on the left, how do you get better outcomes? How do you overcome pain points? Are there some vexing operational or technology or business challenges? Or are you like the lady on the right who's actively looking for the solution that you have? But these are the things to focus on. And again, is what you're presenting timely and relevant? And if it's not a must-have and a nice-to-have, you're probably not going to get a lot of people to sign up, yet alone attend. One of my favorite bits of information is something that I've embraced since I started working with the Content Marketing Institute 6 or 7 years ago. I think the most important thing is realizing that the job of the webinars is to educate and make your attendees more intelligent. They're on a journey. Not everybody is sales ready to buy now. And so taking a content marketing approach means focusing on business value, on best practices, on lessons learned, doing a case study, as opposed to doing a sales pitch, which is very product-centric about the product or the offering. It focuses on features and benefits or pricing. I want to be able to educate people so they can see if they're ready to take the next step. With that, one of the greatest drivers to keep in mind is that the opportunity is greatly enhanced when there's a lot of confusion and a lot of change or industry shifts in your market. I couldn't think of a better example that's more timely right now than healthcare. There is so much disruption and confusion in healthcare that if you've got an innovative solution that can help get better outcomes, you can use the webinar to tell a story beyond sound bites, and it allows you to promote your thought leadership. If you're in retail's also got a lot of disruption. There's just about every industry has got disruption. So think of that as a driver when you come up with a topic or a title. But the most important thing to remember is people are going to buy when they're in pain and they have the money to solve it. That's why the topic and content has to be a must-have or a nice-to-have. If you're in pain, you'll buy painkillers over vitamins any day of the week. Question we often get asked: what are the popular types of thought leadership or B2B themes that you see today? And what we've been seeing consistently is there's three types of webinars, and they can be a blend. The first is a case study where you talk about business improvement. If you look at the slide here, this is a case study on how Parker Aerospace takes advantage of existing workstations to do more simulation. Or a how-to, a tutorial. This was about the use of creating the business case for composites. Everybody who is an engineer and in manufacturing and is in aerospace understands that airplanes today are made with composites. But if you go to more traditional industries, such as bridges and trusses, there's a business case for using composites. So this is what are the business benefits? And of course, one of the greatest is standards and compliance. Again, in any industry that's going through a lot of change, people want to be kept in the know. If you're in such an organization that can help your attendees keep in the know, that's a great thing. For example, this is one we did for Underwriters Laboratory, and it was about discussing standards impacting electric vehicle infrastructure equipment. this reached out to an industry and to people that were curious what is going on. And of course, the question is, where do you find great content? It is all over. You've got industry analysts, white papers, publishers, editors, authors such as CMI. Clients have great success stories, or with partners. There's no shortage of content out there to create a webinar. Now let's take a look at the beginning. We break down the webinar lifecycle into 5 acts. I'm not going to be able to go through each of the acts in detail. It is in the book, and in the planning guide, it is set up in acts. But it all starts with planning. That is the most important part. And then moving into understanding how to attract your audience and beginning to track the metrics, and then doing your content shaping, what we call table reads and dress rehearsals, and doing your final sound check and going live. And of course, the last thing is after the webinar is taking all the analytics and the metrics and figuring out who's sales ready, who needs more nurturing, who's not a fit. But let's take a look at that life cycle and try to demystify it. The 3 objectives are to attract, engage, and convert an audience. When do you do that? You work on attracting before the webinar. The engagement is during the webinar, and the conversion is after. And you do that with 3 basic tools: a deadline-proven methodology, the use of key performance index and metrics, and a set of best practices. And again, these are all covered in our book and in the handout guide if you want to drill down and unpack it more. In fact, there's actually on our website most of it's not gated at all. There's a lot of great free information on metrics and things like that I'll refer to in a bit. Question we often get asked: how long should it take to do a B2B demand gen webinar? And typically, from your completion of the pre-scoping and doing and understanding the business drivers and where you want to go, from the time you kick off, from let's go to go live, is typically 8 weeks. And I say this because this is particularly important if you're going beyond using your house list. There's a lot of time involved in planning everything up front. And I always say that prepare to budget at least 1 hour of pre-production time for each live minute. Another question we often get asked is, what are the most popular days and times for hosting a B2B webinar? Well, I find that the 3 best days are Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Now, if it's a great webinar and it's great content, they'll come any day. We were just talking about this with Stephanie and the team before we went live. I personally like Thursdays. I think by the time you get to Thursday, people have arranged their urgent priorities. If there's any fires they had to put out, they put out. I just think people are more relaxed on Thursday because they've got the weekend coming up. But that's not a reason to not do it on Tuesday or Wednesday. Plus, Thursday gives you just a couple extra days during the week for those final last-minute touches. Good start times, exactly what we're following here. 11 a.m. on the West Coast, 2 p.m. on the West Coast, on the East Coast, and you can figure out the time zones for Central Mountain. Another thing that's important is I talked about by giving expert knowledge, you can collect lifecycle intelligence and metrics. And we have found that tracking webinar metrics really can provide actionable insights for producing predictable outcomes. And when we started this, there really weren't any webinar metrics. Yes, there's email marketing metrics, and we use those too. But I'm going to show you some metrics here that are absolutely predictors. And with over 500 webinars, we can take that to the bank. But there's metrics to collect before the webinar, during the webinar, such as how many people attended, how do people engage in the polls, what kind of audience retention did you have after the webinar, using surveys, on-demand viewing, so on and so forth. Let me tell you the most important metric. This is called the click-through ratio. Now, this is a little different than click-through on opens and around email marketing. The click-through ratio is a measurement of the percent of people who registered for the webinar and compared to those that clicked on the registration page. And it comes up as a percentage, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. But what it predicts, and as I said, this is the gold standard, it will absolutely predict what kind of registration you're going to have, the attendance you're going to have. It also tells you how your registration landing page is connecting with the audience. Is it too salesy? Is it too verbose? And it also helps you measure your value prop and your messaging. The higher the click-through ratio, the more important the topic is in the webinar is to people. Here's how you measure click-through ratio. Regardless of the platform you have, I'm happen to be using one here from GoToWebinar. It's very, very simple. If you look on the on the left-hand side of the screen, it says registration report. The blue circle shows that 98 people have registered. And then at the bottom, it says click on the registration link, 342. So if you divide 342 by 98, you get a click-through ratio of 29%. And this is something that you want to do from the get-go, no pun intended, when you start your daily metrics tracking is to measure this, because this will tell you everything, and it's much better to have this information up front so you can have and deliver predictable outcomes, and you'll find out if your message is connecting. So what does it predict? These numbers will vary, but typically if you're around 25% or a little more than 25%, meaning if 100 people came to the landing page and 25 people registered, tells you you're doing a great job. Your message is specific to the audience's interest. If you're above 35%, you're really doing well. And you're going to see some examples where we had high click-through ratios, and not only was the registration high, but so was the attendance. If you're under 20% or in the teens, something's not connecting. Either your topic, your content, your message, it may look too salesy. There's a lot of different things you can do to troubleshoot that, but that's just to give you an idea. Now, let's jump into a couple of case studies. And I want to start with the first one, which is a publisher called Inside GNSS. And they do, GNSS stands for Global Navigation Satellite Systems. These are rocket scientists. These are people that really want to get in the weeds and learn. And so the publisher came to us and they said, look, we've got an audience that would love to become educated on what's going on today on timely topics. And if we do that right, we think we can move the purchasing needle for its sponsors. So this is a technique and a tactic that this organization has been using for about the last 6 years. Not to get down in the weeds, but if you take a look at some of the titles here, hybrid positioning and technologies for mobile users, space, weather, and GNSS sources, GNSS and unmanned aerial systems, the road ahead. These are very, very technical. And by the way, they're 90-minute webinars. And we have people from all over the world, and they are glued to it because they get the value, because they're educated. But here's what's cool about some of the work that they've had as far as entertaining their audiences and moving the sales needle. We asked at the end of the webinar, having attended today's webinar, what are your plans to purchase or acquire products and services? 47% said it increased. 24% said they were just researching but now intend to acquire. So that's 71% of the audience is really interested. 24% said they were researching, see no need, 5% decreased. Now, what this shows you too is the average click-through ratio is about 45%. It pulls in from, I think we get about 700 people from 70 countries around the world, and the attendance is 50%, and that's still counting all those organizations outside the North America. So this definitely ties into what I was saying as far as having a timely must-have topic. Here's another case study that was a real fun one to do. And it's a company that was located in the UK. And the company's name is Sandstone. And what they do is they provide global team building that's either virtual or in person. And they wanted to penetrate the US market. And here was a time when their objective was, how can you help us raise the awareness with senior level and budgeting executives who hold the purse strings to see if there's an appetite for our type of offering, either online or in person. And so this was done, and there was a expert third-party speaker who actually was able to deliver a case study on their outcomes and their results, which added a tremendous amount of credibility to it. But here's what happened. There's a 27% click-through ratio. The attendance was 50%. Now, this is a company that you would never know of, but their topic was so compelling and went to the right audience demographic that 548 people from 40 states and 17 countries joined to attend the webinar, or joined to register for the webinar, because we went after a value proposition and executive profile that matched what we thought their interest would be. They took their first order within a month after the webinar, and they've also won since then more than 2 significant orders, but right after 2 significant orders. They trained 250 people and another for training 300 people. This one here was also another fun one. This is an organization called Cox Automotive, and they're a large family of automobile specialty offerings. Kelley Blue Book, Autotrader.com. There's a lot of companies, and one of them is called Stockwave, and they have a very, very innovative way of helping automobile dealerships use a very, very interesting game-changing approach that simplifies the complex challenges in wholesale buying. They had so much demand that they wanted to do a sneak preview to show them how they could use this. Again, what industry, as I said, health, but think of the industries such as retail or how you buy a car or car dealerships. These are going through massive disruption. And so this was a great opportunity, again, to go beyond sound bites and show people how this could benefit them. So we took a survey. We always take a survey. And at the end of the webinar, we found that 60% of the audience said it exceeded their expectations. 26% said it was above. 10% said it met. 2% said it barely met or did not meet. Well, that's okay. 96%, I'll take that any day of the week. 60% is great. But here's what else we learned in using metrics. We used these online polls, and we asked at the end, based on today's webinar, which of the following would be of most interest to you? 32% said, I want to schedule a one-on-one demo. So they opted in. They said, yeah, please call me. 15% said, yeah, contact me to get started. 28% said, send me the brochure. 25% still considering. So this is a very non-invasive way of finding those people that are interested, but in real time, getting these metrics, which is a wonderful use case for polls. But then on the post-webinar survey, we also asked, what is their intent to purchase? And we said, having attended today's webinar, your plans to purchase or acquire the solution. 72% increased. 17% said they were just researching, but now they intend to acquire. 6% were just researching, but see no need. 5% said it decreased. So 89% had an interest in acquiring. But it gets better. After the webinar, and usually we're out of the picture after we've delivered the final analytics, I called back and I spoke with them, and I said, can you tell me about some of the results that you've been having? And so he says, yeah, the webinar that we did with you helped kickstart sales. And I said, could you quantify it? In the first month, they were able to have $3 million a month in recurring revenue. I said, what about the second month? He said, about the same. He said, do you care about the third? I said, no, you made my point. That's what I wanted to know. You more than handsomely paid for your investment. This is because they had something that truly solved the pain point. It was in a very disruptive industry, and they gave solid information. Now let's take a moment to talk about some blunders that, and this was tough to pick the top 10 webinar blunders because there's hundreds of them. And you'll see a lot of things here that you'll say, well, you could have included this, you could have included that, and you're absolutely right. But let's start with them. The first one, and this is sacrosanct, it's all about planning. It goes back to the business drivers. If you fail to plan to fail. Be clear on what your webinar objectives are. And make sure it's going to provide value to the attendees. And what are your success factors? How are you going to know if the webinar was successful? Is it number of people registered, number of people that attended, how many leads you got, how many deals you closed? Whatever those success factors are, define them. And what's the call to action? You'd be surprised how many people do webinars and forget to have a call to action because you've had the audience listening. Tell them what you want them to do next, how you can help them. And then, of course, analyze the life cycle intelligence. The second blunder is not making the audience your top priority. If there's one person on or 1,000, you are the whole reason that we're here. And more than that, we have a contract with you, and that's to deliver on the promise of the webinar invitation. And this is an easy area. The reason I say it's a blunder, if you don't do this and you go off too far and you don't deliver on what you promised, I guarantee you're going to lose your audience quicker than you can sneeze. The third is not collecting or mining intelligence. I'm not going to go through each of these again, but as I said, going back to the planning of before, during, and after, it's a golden opportunity to capture life cycle intelligence, and it is enormously helpful in being able to analyze where things are at. Probably blunder number 4 on ignoring email marketing best practices. By the way, we could do a webinar on any one of these slides or any one of these bullets. But I think what's important to remember is that the invitation copy that you're going to be sending out, that it aligns with the audience profile. It doesn't talk up, doesn't talk down, but it nets out what the business problem is, what you'll learn, and here's what you'll walk away with. And then from the actual executing of the campaign, we always want to go 3 weeks before we go live. And the reason is we want to do testing and measure our tracking. Because if we do need to retool and come up with a different subject line or a different topic or change the landing page, now's the time to do it. And when it comes to email subject lines, they are extremely critical. And it's also important that you have email subject lines that capture the reader's attention, because let's face it, it's very binary. It ends up in your inbox. If you don't like that subject line, not only you're not going to open it and register, you'll probably delete it. And you always want to swap email subject lines between drips. And then if you're going to use outside list sources, make sure you know who you're buying from. Make sure that they have stats that can show you the type of bounce rates they have. And you want to keep them in good hygiene, even if you have a house list, because people change jobs. It's a good idea every 90 days to send that to a third party, such as Experian or LeadSpan, where they will check against the email addresses to find out if there's any invalid ones. And that's important because email marketing platforms and marketing automation platforms are getting stingier and stingier on what kind of bounce rates or how hard bounce rates you can have. And many of them want you under 5%. And of course, to make sure that you're CAN spam compliant. That's very, very important. And finally, again, tracking the daily metrics to optimize the registration is critical. Number 5 is Death by PowerPoint. That's actually a real book, Death by PowerPoint. I got it on Amazon, where I probably get just about everything else. And it's really interesting. And it talks about the importance of making sure that your slides are visually appealing. And as I said, you want to tell a story. You don't want to read the bullet points. And you want to keep one main idea or topic per slide. And authenticity wins every time. Even if you flub something, the audience doesn't care. They'll embrace you because you're being authentic. If you're reading to them, they're going to check out. Audio is the webinar's Achilles heel. The instrument to connect with a webinar is your voice. But it's not only your voice, it's the devices you use. And if you don't do frequent sound checks with your speakers to see how they sound and know where they're going to be on webinar day, you run the risk of not optimally connecting. Now, the reason I have that universal symbol there is these are devices we do not recommend you use. And I'm going to show you why in just a second. Speaker phones, they may look easy to use, but they create a barrier and they take the warmth away. Using an open mic on a PC or a Mac can cause the same problem, and worse than that, it can cause echo and feedback. And cell phones, they're just not reliable. Anything with a battery in it, you never know if it's going to go down. So to sound like a broadcaster, there's a couple different types of devices you can use. A landline, which of course has a handset on it. You can use a professional USB mic like the one I'm using, or a consumer headset microphone. And again, going back to our good friends at Amazon, you can get these for $27. Now, let me just show you something. I'm going to mute myself here and pick up a cell phone and see if you guys can hear the difference. I'm not talking on a cell phone. Hopefully you can hear a difference between the cell phone and my mic. I'm going to come back to my mic. Stephanie, did you hear a difference there?
Oh, yes. Big difference. Big,
Okay.
big difference. Yes.
In
Point
fact,
well taken.
let me spend 1 minute on this. When we do our kickoff meetings with clients, we always ask them their webinar experience, where are they going to be on webinar day, and we always can tell if they are optimally mic'd, and usually they're not. And we ask them, do you have a computer headset or do you have a USB headset? And if the answer is no, I say, would you mind sending us your address through the chat? We'll send you one right away. For $27, it's worth it. We don't charge them for it. We send it out. And the reason is it's going to make them connect with their audience better, and they're going to sound like a broadcaster. It's not even worth trying to convince somebody. So I could not recommend more importance being placed on the audio device. And that's one of the things that I love about this platform, is that you can use USB in voice over IP, or you can use a handset or whatever you want. But I think it makes such a difference with USB. So let's go to number 7. A skilled moderator is someone who's got your back, and they're really a coach. They're there to make you shine. They're there to make sure you're successful and to have the expert knowledge on all of the technology. And if something goes south, they know how to rebound. And they help you choreograph the webinar. Plus, they create more of a dialogue than a monologue. Stephanie's wonderful. She can come in and we can talk about things, and it just makes it more interesting. But a skilled moderator is just so important on every webinar. The 8th blunder is skipping the final webinar day sound check. And again, you never know what's going to happen. There's always going to be surprises, so have a plan B. And part of that plan B could be if there's a problem with your microphone, that you're dialed in and you can pick up the handset if you need to. It's always a great idea to print out a hard copy of your PowerPoint notes, to have them in front of you. Don't forget to turn off and silence your cell phones, any non-essential apps, disable pop-ups, and put a sign on your door, do not disturb. You'd be surprised how many people walk in. The 9th blunder is being unprepared. And being unprepared starts with not making your audience the top priority. Start on time and end on time. Make sure you deliver on the promises in your invitation. And it's okay to be enthusiastic. It's okay to excite, but it's not for selling. Selling is after the webinar. And make sure there's a call to action of what you want people to do. And remember, it's all about connection, not perfection. You don't have to be 100% perfect. Then the final blunder is skipping the critical post-webinar housekeeping tasks. Sending thank you emails and a link to the recording, doing the final analytics, beginning to segment the leads, following up on unanswered questions. People have questions, they expect them to be answered. Let people know you'll follow up on it. So these are the 10 top blunders, and I could easily have a webinar all day on 100 of them. But the thing to remember is the time to sell is after the webinar. When you're done with the webinar, then you can go into selling. So let's talk a couple of ways to get started, and we're going to get to the questions in just a moment. A few years ago, someone asked me, what do you think are the 3 biggest myths about webinars? And this pretty much summarizes what we've been talking about. The first myth is people think just build it and they will come. Ain't going to happen. This one's just as dangerous. Hey, I'm a great presenter. I don't need to rehearse. I'll just show up and wing it. No, don't do that. That's a recipe for disaster. And then the third one is that people think, hey, everybody who attended sales ready and they're going to buy now. Again, they're on a journey. And our goal is to move them from just researching to being ready to buy now, but they're on a journey. And I talk about these myths in the sense that all of these, if you are able to not succumb to them, will help you improve the adoption rate of using webinars in your organization, because you'll have successful outcomes. And if you have successful outcomes, you'll continue to get funding and retain the use of webinars for other activities. I mentioned these complementary planning resources. I highly recommend them. They are designed as how-to. The one thing I haven't shown here that I'll talk about in just a moment is we even have an 8-hour series of online video modules to teach you to become a master webinar producer. So to continue the conversation, feel free to go to our website. As I said, it's ungated except for our books, and you're more than welcome to those. But we have a lot of information on best practice videos, case studies. We have the WebAttract Thought Leadership Group on LinkedIn. My Twitter handle is @WebinarReady. We have a lot of our SlideShare on SlideShare. And then I talked about the certification on how you can produce demand generation webinars and become a master webinar producer. And we have a special offer for today's attendees that if you purchase Webinar Ready by this Friday, you can take an additional 20% off. And there's the coupon code. Stephanie, I want to go right now into the Q&A. So I'm ready to take anything you've got for me.
All right, awesome. First of all, I just want to just kind of applaud your comment to the audience about, well, you don't want to wing it. You don't have to be a perfectionist either. That's one of the biggest mistakes I see people make. They try to be so fully scripted, have everything perfectly rehearsed and said, and it doesn't sound like a conversation anymore. You know, I think it's just so much better when you're actually having a conversation with the audience, which I feel like we're doing today. So love that. But let's talk about some more of those blunders. You mentioned a bunch of them. What do you think is the single biggest blunder? Like, what do you want this audience to walk away with today? If anything, don't do this. Don't make this mistake. What is it?
It would be making sure that you do your due diligence, that you pick a topic and content that's going to excite and connect with your audience, that's going to help them. Make sure that as you look at it, that it's going to really help them overcome a pain point or get better outcomes. That's the most important thing. And if you can't answer that and look at that and say, if I got an invitation on this, would I be interested to open it up and register and go back to the drawing board? That's the most important thing I could say.
Fantastic. Yeah, know those pain points. Know your audience for sure. That's great. Okay, there's a question here from Jessica, who's looking for your thoughts on a semi-live webinar. So essentially, where you record the presentation in advance, but then you host a live Q&A on game day. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that are, there's a couple. One, the time involved to do that is actually more than doing it live. We're doing this live, right? If we weren't doing this live, Stephanie, I would say, well, let me take that over again. Well, let me do this. Let me do that. And it loses the momentum and the spontaneity. Now, I know some people like to do that. I find that doing it live, if you're prepared and you go through all the things that we talk about, you'll come off better. Plus, audiences prefer a live webinar. It's okay to do that, and sometimes we've had situations where one of our featured speakers could not make it for whatever. Well, we pre-recorded them in advance. We told the audience that. But I like live. I just think it's a much better way to go, and it's more efficient.
Great. Okay, I agree. Question here from Hannah. Is there a sweet spot in duration? Can an hour sometimes be too long or 30 minutes too short? Do you have any advice on length?
Yes. The answer is if you're going to do a educational webinar like we're doing today, a tutorial or a case study or whatever, you really need about an hour, because you only have, if you take away the introduction, the time for polls, and you want to leave 15 minutes of Q&A, it's probably 30, 35 minutes. Mm-hmm. However, not everything you're doing demands that much time. And if you can get to the point and get your message out in less than that, go for it. I mean, I'm from LA, and I think, I grew up in the most, with a lot of entertainment, and I think one of my favorite sayings was nobody, get off the stage while you're a hit. Nobody ever got upset if you get done with your presentation early. An hour is a good benchmark for a B2B webinar. But again, it depends on what the topic is, who the audience is, what you're hoping to get across. Okay?
Yeah, people love the gift of time. There's no question about that. And I always have this sort of 15-2 rule. Like, it's okay to end 15 minutes early, and people will appreciate the time. But anything more than 15 minutes early, they may feel a little cheated if they, set aside the hour. And, of course, you never want to go over the time, right? You agree? Like, you can't really...
Oh, absolutely. And questions are good. I mean, look, I love when questions come in because that shows that the audience is engaged and they're interested. So absolutely. But I totally agree with you. And to the other point I made on those global navigation system webinars, they're 90 minutes. They have 2 Q&A sessions, and the people are glued. The retention on those is about 90%. So it really, again, it comes back to the topic and your audience of what you're trying to accomplish.
Great. Okay. Question from Rebecca. What is the optimal number of emails you should send to an attendee before and after your webinar?
Well, that really depends on what type of registration you're looking for. And I actually have something here. Let me see if I can find it. I'll come back to that. Okay. Can you guys see this? Can you see that, Stephanie?
Yeah.
This is a question I get asked a lot. How do you target what kind of registration you're going to have? And typically, when we're looking at going at an audience that doesn't know us or that isn't in our house list, I like to use 50,000 contacts that match the webinar value proposition, the right audience demographic. And we know that if we go 3 weeks before the live date and we execute 4 or 5 drips or touch points across those 3 weeks every couple of days, we know that we will get between 1/4 to 1/2 of 1% to register, or 125 to 250. Now that will usually translate to a registration or attendee ratio of about 40%. So this is back of the envelope, rule of thumb. As the commercials say, your mileage will vary. This is typical. It does change, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But this is typically what we see. And again, that means doing subject line swaps, tracking your metrics, knowing where you're at. But so if something like this, it's probably about 200,000 to 250,000. And another important thing to add is for each drip, for subsequent drips, only send it to the people that did not open the first drip or registered for the webinar. You don't want to keep hitting people over and over again. If they've registered, that's good enough. You suppress that. So you send the second drip to everybody who did not open, and then the third drip to everybody that did not open the first and the second, so on and so forth. Does that answer that?
Yeah, excellent advice on the drips too. And we've got some resources on CMI's website too to help you with drip campaigns, just so you don't kind of venture into that, hitting somebody up more than once when they've already registered. So good advice. All right, so I think you answered Natalie's question here about how many attendees is a good number for a first-time webinar. But are there any specific benchmarks she should aim for?
I would say that anywhere between 30% and 40%. Our floor is 40%. Now, in some cases, when we see a high click-through ratio, we know we're going to exceed 40%. We've had some webinars where it's been as high as a 60, 67% attendee ratio. But I think if you get 30% on your first webinar, high fives. 40% even better. But again, go back to all the things we talked about, and you go through our guide, you'll see the things that you need to do to make sure you get that.
Great. So question from Pablo. This is from Erica. Should you have a Q&A at the end? Well, clearly we like Q&A, but what do you feel in terms of best practices? Is it necessary to always have a Q&A?
Well, I would say 99.9% yes, because this is now the opportunity where it becomes more of a dialogue. It's not just the presenter talking. It gives the audience a chance who has an interest to learn more, to ask questions. Plus, by seeing the number of questions that come in, you can get an idea of the engagement and the types of questions they're asking. And that gives you some valuable feedback, but it also keeps the audience engaged. So I would not recommend not doing Q&A for webinars. In fact, the global navigation webinars that we do, they're 90 minutes. We have 2 Q&A sessions. We break it up after 45 minutes, and then we have a 15, 20 minutes before the end. Audiences love that. They love to have Q&A.
Yeah, and I think it's great, too, if you run out of time for all of the questions that come in, because sometimes questions really start to load up towards the end. It's a great opportunity to follow up with people one-on-one.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, Pablo, since I called your name out, I'm going to answer your question. Yes, there will be a recording of the webinar available in about 24 hours. So stay tuned. We'll email that to you. All right, question from James. What is your favorite strategy to determine session content, or how do you involve your market on the front end?
Here's what we do, James. There's a scoping document that we put together called the Pre-Discovery Production Backgrounder. And we want to ask a lot of questions about how well are they known in the market, what is the unique value proposition of what they're talking about, is it disruptive, what problems are you solving, do you have any case studies, better than having a case study, do you have a client or a partner who would love to get and share their experience? So a lot of it comes from understanding what the particular webinar has to offer. And I think that's a really important question. That's all part of the planning cycle, is really looking at it. What do they have to offer? Because, you know, when people say they want to do a webinar, okay, what do you want to do a webinar about? And why do you think anybody would come? And I think a check on that, I mentioned it earlier, is ask yourself, would you want to attend a webinar on what you're producing? Those are the top things that I would say.
Great. All right. Question here about, since you're talking about sort of prepping for it, how many practice sessions are necessary for a webinar? What kind of time commitments should speakers expect?
Well, we have a policy and a practice of doing what we call a table read, and that's about 60 to 90 minutes. And we do a sound check, and really it's getting everybody around the campfire. It's bringing our speaker on and getting an opportunity to get everybody familiar with the goals and the objectives, and then making sure what the deliverables are in the invitation, who's going to say what in what time frame. That's the first one. We follow that up with 2 dress rehearsals. Those can be also 60 to about 90 minutes, and we want to do a timed read on the final one. Now, the interesting thing is, and we get a lot of great speakers who in the beginning are like, do we really need to put that much time in, Mike? Do we really need to do it? And we say, look, let's just go for these here. Stick with us. We've got your back. We're going to make you successful. And invariably, Stephanie, we will get many of our speakers after the second dress rehearsal. Could we schedule a third? We'd like to do another one. Absolutely. Because again, it goes back to, it's a whole different experience in presenting on a webinar than it is being live and in person. So three sessions is what we do.
Excellent. All right. I think this one is referring to one of your case studies. At what point in the webinar did you use polls to gauge sales readiness? So that the stats you were showing us about sales readiness, when did you pull that poll up in that webinar? Do you remember?
Yes. At the end of the webinar. Give and get. After we've given a lot of valuable information, now we'd like to ask you in the audience to give us some feedback based upon attending today's webinar. And then those are the questions, and we let them fill it out. Now, we don't share that with the audience because it's proprietary, but we capture that information. The second question on intent to purchase is usually in the post-webinar survey. GoToWebinar has a great survey capability where you can ask a couple of questions, and one of them is, how today's webinar meets your expectations. That's where we do the satisfaction survey. What did you like? What could we do better? What other topics would you be interested in? And finally, help us understand, by attending today's webinar, your intent to purchase. First off, anybody who does that has opted in. There's no pressure on anybody. And if they opt in, there's an interest in it. That's where we typically put it in. So hopefully I answered the question, Stephanie.
Yeah, and this was actually somewhat similar since we're nearing the end of our time here. This is a good one from Sam. How can we have the audience geared up for more details to give it a chance for post-webinar conversions to increase?
Well, one of the ways to do that is, and we use lots of metrics, as I said. There's 6 key metrics. And by measuring where people are at, their level of engagement, how long they were on the webinar for, what they're interested in, so on and so forth, gives us an idea, are they sales ready or are they just researching and we need to put them in a nurturing bucket? It really depends on an individual basis. The kind of questions they ask. Go to webinar, we'll capture all those questions. We'll tell you where they're at. And so you have to make some judgments at that time on how you want to follow up. But I think the first thing to do is to find out where they're at after the webinar. You can certainly continue nurturing them with timely information. Those are the kinds of things to do. Folks, again, take a look at the collateral and the assets we gave you. If you're interested in it and you have questions, we'd be more than happy to speak with you. But that's what I want you to do. Go back and look at your next webinar and how you can make it better. And hopefully we can come back and do some more. So Stephanie, back to you.
Fantastic. All right. Mike, thank you so much for such a great discussion. And thanks to GoToWebinar for sponsoring today. The link will be sent to you tomorrow. So if you'd like to share this webinar with any of your colleagues or give it another listen, just look in your email. We'll get that out to you. And if you want any more information on Content Marketing Institute, please visit our website that you see in front of you there. Many, many thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.